Welcome once again to today's lesson. We are going to continue with our previous topic, that is economic planning and development. Our first lesson was a bit short, but this one is going to be quite lengthy. And we are going to just continue from where we stopped. We were covering the indicators of economic development, or what we refer to as the structures that indicate that there is economic development. And these structures of economic development, they are also referred to as the characteristics of economic development. So whether you're talking about characteristics, whether you're talking about the indicators or structures that need to be put in, all of them to be put in place to ensure that there is economic development, all of them they refer to the same thing. So we talked about the increment of living standards as one of the indicators of this economic development. We also talked about the reduction in inequalities of income. So the third one is connected with issues of education. So when we have reduced illiteracy levels, then we also say that there is that's an indicator of economic development. And so when you talk about the government putting its resources in ensuring that children go to school, that they learn, there is the literacy levels are raised, that can be an indicator of economic development. Because as we said, when we are talking about economic development, this is issues to do with both quantity and quality. The quality of, in this case, we would talk of the way of living. So when there is increased literacy levels in terms of quality, then we say that people are better off in terms of their quality of living as compared to when they are not literate. So reduced literacy levels is an indicator of economic development. Then we also look at increase in skilled manpower. It's closely related to literacy levels, reduced literacy levels. But specifically here, you're talking about the skills that we acquire, the skills that one gets, so that you can be able now to participate in the economic development. When you have gone to school, it's not just a matter of knowing how to read and write, because that is what it's all about when it comes to literacy levels. But now this is more than just that literacy level. We are talking about acquiring skills so that you can be able to use your skills to generate income for yourself and even for the country, because we talk about income that is to benefit you as a person and also to benefit the society, to benefit the country. Improvement in health facilities within the country. That is another characteristic of economic development. When there is improved health facilities within a country, then we say that there is an increase in economic development. That is why every time you always find the government, like for example our government, it uses a lot of its resources every time when there is presentation of the budget document in the parliament. You always hear the government allocating, every time they talk of increasing allocation of resources to health facilities, whether to build these clinics, whether to build these hospitals, whether it is employing more nurses, more doctors. Like now we are having the challenge of the COVID-19. You hear that the government has put a lot of its resources to employ more personnel in health sector, not just for this particular pandemic, but possibly to ensure that the health facilities, even as the government fights this pandemic, the issues of health is very important as a way of indicating that people have really increased, the the economic development of our country has actually increased, and which ensures that there is even improvement of ways of life, improvement of technology and entrepreneurial ability, improvement in technology. Right now, we are talking about e-learning. We are talking about learning through internet. When we have all this improvement, as we compare our way of the level of development currently, if you compare it with how we used to have it some few years back, there is a lot of difference. There is a lot of improvement. So we can actually say, as we have developed in terms of technology, and that's an indicator that there is there is economic development in our country because of just looking at the technology. When you talk about entrepreneurial ability, we are talking about how have people been able to go about their businesses? How have people been able to make a difference in terms of how they are carrying out their business activities? If you compare currently, the government is actually using a lot of its resources to ensure that people are able to be more entrepreneurial in terms of venturing into various businesses. As we saw in international trade, the government has put in place a lot of measures to ensure that, one, people have a lot of information as regards to business opportunities. Other than just having this information, the government ensures that even for those people who do not have the financial capability, those people who are less privileged in terms of their resources, the government ensures that it has provided them with resources, whether it is by giving, sometimes funding them, whether it is by giving loans. We know of very many government loaning facilities, whether it is to the women, whether it is to the youth, whether it is to the physically challenged. So all this is a way of ensuring all these. The government is doing all this to ensure that there is the entrepreneurial ability is uplifted, and that's an indicator of economic development. Improvement of infrastructure. So we know that this infrastructure is very important. Infrastructure is a major component in any economy. When you're talking about electricity, we talk about provision of water, we talk about provision of security, we talk about all these forms the infrastructure that we are talking about, and therefore it means that when this infrastructure is improved, then it means that we can say that there is an increase in economic development. Even when you talk about, now we are talking about another indicator of economic development. When there is improvement of institutions that handle methods of economic activities, new methods of economic activities, when you have all these institutions that the government comes up with, it funds all these institutions to enable people to be able to produce, to enable people to have more skills in terms of production activities. This is an indicator of economic development, and therefore it means that with all this, without forgetting about the industrial development. The industrial development, when you're talking about holistically the development of the industry, the government uses a lot of its resources to ensure that there is improvement, or there is industrial development, and which actually it is even connected with moving away from agricultural production to shifting, what you refer to as shifting from agricultural production to manufacturing and processing. This is an indicator of economic development. Instead of where we, for example, produce maize and just sell this maize or without having any value increment, without having any value addition in this maize, then we say that possibly there is the level of development is a bit low when we don't have this value addition. But when we have this value addition, that instead of just selling this maize in its raw form, instead of just exporting this maize in its raw form when it has been harvested, when we process this maize and its value is increased to maize flour and even to other components, could be cattle feed and all that, then we say that this is an indicator of development. That's why we are saying that when there is increase in industrial production, that is an indicator of economic development. So to sum it up all, having looked at the indicators of this economic development, it's good to note that just as we said, economic development is all about quality. It's all about improving quality of living, both qualitative and quantitative. But also, when we talk about economic development, it can also be defined as an increase in real output per capita, because we know very well that when we talk about per capita, as the average income of all the income earners within a given country. So when you talk of now this real output per capita, the real output per capita, which is actually associated with improvement in the ways of life. That's all what is about economic development. And now, having talked about economic development and economic growth, I think this is another opportunity. Now we can try to ask ourselves, having looked at economic growth and economic development, what are the differences? What is that one can be able to look at and say that we are not only talking about economic growth in this case, but also economic development. So we look at the differences between economic growth and economic development. Differences between economic growth and economic development. So maybe what you can do, you can have these points tabulated so that on one side you can have the economic growth and the other side you can have economic development. Though when you talk of comparing, you can still compare. We know how we respond to questions on comparison. You can have a table, you can have a statement. So depending on how you phrase your statement, it can be possible for one to see the difference between those two components that you're comparing. The first difference, we look at economic development, that is economic growth. Economic growth, one, it does not ensure reduced inequalities in national income. Remember what is talked about economic development. On the other side, economic development ensures that there is reduced inequality in distribution of income. Remember we said that with economic growth, we can have economic growth when we have just very few people who have possibly have a very huge increment in their income, whereas very many people possibly within the same economic setup have not increased their income. And so here we are saying that one difference is with the economic growth, it does not ensure reduced inequality in income distribution, but with economic development, it does. So with economic development, it ensures that there is reduced inequality in income distribution. With economic growth, it's another point two. Point number two, with economic growth, it is quantitative. It is a quantitative increase in the size of a country's national income. It is quantitative. Remember where we talked about even using some values. When you talk about an increment of, we are talking of 6.5, we are talking about 10%. That is only it is quantitative. But with economic development, it is both quantitative and qualitative. It is both quantitative and qualitative increment in a country's economy. So that's why we talked about when you say people have improved in their ways of living, then we can say that it's not only in terms of using values, it's not just in terms of using values in percentage form, but even in terms of the way of their living, that there is improvement in their way of living. Economic growth measures what we refer to as, it is just growth that measures the rate of the GDP. It is economic growth where it measures increase in the rate of GDP. With economic development, the growth measures, it's measured in terms of welfare of living, in terms of ways of living, in terms of improved standard of living. Point noted. The other point is economic growth, it can be realized without economic development. It is true. We can say there is economic growth without economic development. But on the other side, we cannot say that there is economic development. So we say economic development cannot be realized. Cannot be realized without economic growth. And because it involves both the increment in terms of quantity and in terms of quality. And on the other side, with economic growth, it is only in terms of quantity. So those are the four major differences between economic growth and economic development. And so as of now, I want us now to look at something else, not something different, but having talked about economic development, I think it's still going to be in order for us to ask ourselves, if it is true that we are talking about economic development, and we have even gone ahead to look at what are those indicators of economic development, then one may ask a question. Because it is true that we would want to embrace economic development, because that is sorry for that interruption. So we ask ourselves, it is true that we've looked at the characteristics of economic development, but because any country will always be looking forward to realizing this economic development, the question that we need to ask ourselves is, what if now, instead of having this economic development, it is like now the universe of this? Because it's only when we realize that things are not working that we can possibly, as we are going to find with our next topic, that is in terms of planning, we ask ourselves, things are not working, then what do we need to do so that things can work? And so here I'm talking about, as we talk about economic development, we can only say that there is development if initially there wasn't development. And so we would want to look at now, what are these characteristics of the universe of development? What are these characteristics of other development? So we are talking about other development. That is something that we need to ask ourselves. What are the characteristics of other development? And I believe from what we have so far covered, it can be possible for you as the learner. I want to pause for 2 minutes. I want you to just think, from what you have covered so far, what are the characteristics of other development? Right. I think I can go through the points that I have, and then you can possibly check. Are you able to give the points possibly the same as the ones that we are going to discuss? Or are you going to have some points which are closely related to what we have? And the first one is, one indicator of underdevelopment is low levels of economic growth. And this can be, for example, due to poor allocation of resources by the government, of course. Remember, we said that we cannot have economic development without economic growth. And so when we have low levels of economic growth, that by itself, in the long run, we talk about in the long run, in a period long enough, where we talk about not just for example, in a very simple language at your level. Possibly that period can be more than 1 year, could be more than 2 years, could be more than. So low levels of economic growth due to poor resource allocation. That possibly this year, we are talking about, for example, the GDP this year. If, for example, in our country, say for whatever challenges that we are facing currently, that possibly the GDP, as it had been projected to grow at 6.5 or around that figure, the CS for Finance has so far reviewed it downwards to, I think, almost 3%. When there is this, the GDP grows by, for a continuous period of time. 1 year it is at 1%, another year is 2%, another year it is 3%. We can actually say that in the long run, for a given period of time, for a number of periods that we may compare this economic growth, eventually we may not be able to talk about economic development. We can say if the figures for economic growth have been low for a given very long period of time. Remember, we talked about gradual growth, economic development as that steady growth in economic growth. That is in GDP, like for example, that if this year we have 3.0%, the next year we have 3.1. Yeah, the next year it is 2. So within that period, we can actually say that the level of development is also going to be very low, and it is very clear because when you talk of this 3.0, 3.1, very low figures, it means that the government is actually not allocating a lot of resources in those projects that can actually lead us to economic development. Possibly it is only allocating all whatever is earning, maybe to what we refer to as recurrent expenditure instead of capital expenditure. Remember what we learned in international trade. That is even in public finance. That when you have capital expenditure, it means that government is spending in those projects which possibly can, in future, for example, be able to generate some income. But when it's now allocating all its resources in recurrent expenditure to pay, for example, for salaries, I don't know, for those expenses that keep on recurring on a yearly basis, then it means that eventually we may not be able to have economic development. So when we have low levels of economic growth, then that's an indicator of low underdevelopment, what we are referring to as underdevelopment. And on the other side now, if we have high growth of economic, high growth in terms of GDP, talk of 6, talk of even double digits, talk of even 10 or even 11, that means that even in terms of economic development, it's also going to be high. Too much of that. Another indicator of underdevelopment is increased rural-urban migration. And this one is more or less connected with people searching for employment in urban areas. We know that when there is enormous rural-urban migration, people moving from rural areas to urban centers, that first of all is an indicator that possibly these people who are in rural areas, these people, when when they are in those rural areas, they are not able to feel their standard of living is a bit low, and so they feel that maybe in urban areas, that's where we can be able to have our living improved. And so when we have people moving now from rural areas to urban centers, that can also be an indicator of underdevelopment. So when you talk of these people now moving to look for employment, to look for even better social amenities, to look for those facilities that may not be available in rural areas, then we say that possibly there is underdevelopment in that particular economic setup. High levels of poverty, that's another indicator. I think without overemphasizing this, when you talk about high levels of poverty, I think no one cannot be in a position of describing what you mean by poverty. Where we talk of people not being in a position of sustaining their living from the income that they are earning. If, for example, we have people who are in those rural areas where, or even some urban setup, for example, in slums, where they cannot be able to afford 2 meals in a day. These people cannot be able to afford even to have good housing facilities. It means that these people are living in poverty, or they are poor. And so when we have high levels of poverty, then that can be again a way of describing underdevelopment. High disparity in levels of income, high disparity in income distribution. When there is very high disparity of income distribution, remember you talked about where there could be some few people who are earning a lot of income, and we have again very many people who are earning low income. When the difference between the rich and the poor is too much, then it means that there is underdevelopment. When we have very many people who are very poor, and again in terms of income they are earning very low, and the ones who are again rich, they are extremely rich, then you can say that can be an indicator of underdevelopment. Low levels of savings and investment. If you remember again in national income, when we talked about vicious cycle of poverty, when we have this vicious cycle of poverty, remember where it starts from earnings. When people have low earnings, they cannot be able to have they can only afford the basic items. They cannot be able to have any investments. They cannot be able to invest. And we know that it is through these investments that it's possible to be able to generate even more income. And that is why we said that it is a vicious cycle of poverty, because you do not have enough income. You are not able to invest. You are not able to generate even more income from that income. So you continue generating low income. And when you generate low income, it means that you continue living in this in poverty, and so it continues as a cycle, even the way it is explained. For example, even in that family setup, where maybe, sorry to say so, that possibly there is maybe that person who, if it's the main person who is earning for that family is not able to earn enough to be able to invest. He's only earning enough to feed for the family. So meaning this person may not even be able to, for example, invest, or even at times even take his children to school, so that eventually these people who are not earning a lot of income currently, they're not able to take their children to school. Maybe they are not able to go to even they are not able to go even to college, where they can be able to have skills which can enable them to be entrepreneurs, who can be able to engage in business activities, who can be able to even by themselves invest and be able now to break that what we refer to as the vicious cycle of poverty. And so that's why we are saying that when there is low levels of saving, it is like now that vicious cycle of poverty, where the father was poor, the children are poor, the children of these children continue being poor. That is why the government having realized that if the necessary measures are not taken to ensure that this vicious cycle of poverty is broken, at times it can continue being just like that for generations and generations. That's why the government comes up with their structures that tries to break this kind of vicious cycle of so-called poverty. So, for example, when the government is providing free primary and even subsidized secondary education and even high levels, universities, colleges, education, it is a way of trying to break this so that even that person who comes from that family which cannot be able to invest, they can only afford to just buy food for their survival. They are not able to invest and be able to generate more income. At least when we have these children going to school, they are provided with skills which they can be able now to be on their own, and they can be able now to break this vicious cycle of poverty, and they can be able now to have a better way of living. So we are saying when there is low levels of savings and investment, this is an indicator of underdevelopment, high population growth rate. And this is due to high birth rates, of course. Sometimes, if you remember with what we talked about in population and where we even talked about some traditional way of there are some people traditionally who believed that probably having maybe a high number of children in a family setup, that was taken as, there are times when having very many children was taken as, somebody was taken to be a very rich person, and it was obvious that these people they were taken to be rich families because when these people were providing labor in their farms, this person who possibly was able to have very many children was able to get a lot of labor provided by the children in their farms, and so these people were able to, they are taken like they are rich. Rich people as compared maybe to others who were not having very many children. Even some African setup, there are some families who again believed that when they had very many children, they were able to get, I don't know, even for girls, they are able to get a lot of dowry, and they are taken to be like, they are very rich. But you realize that these days, it is not the same. It is not the same, because if, for example, you think of that person who was hiring very many children to be able to provide that cheap labor in their farms. Do we still have those very large farms currently? No, we don't have. And so sometimes when we have now this high population growth rate, it is no longer taken as if it is an indicator of a better way of living. These days it is not an indicator of a better way of living. Actually, it is vice versa. That you have those very large families, and instead of having these people being provided with quality education, being provided with quality way of living, the one who is earning in that particular family setup may not be able to afford to bring up 10 children or even, I don't know, 7, 8. So in our current Kenyan setup, talking of 2 kids or even 3 kids, even more, that means that one is able to take care of that number of children, and possibly that's a good possibly can be taken as a moderate kind of a family. And so when you have high population growth rates, this is an indicator of, can be taken as an indicator of underdevelopment. Dominance over subsistence sector. Remember, we said that one indicator of development is where a country is able to move away from agricultural production to more than just doing agriculture, where you're talking about manufacturing, processing. And so when we talk of that country that continues to remain in that subsistence sector, where it is just producing without going the commercial, where we know when we go commercial, we are able now to mechanize your farming, we are able to go beyond just production, and you are able to have more value on whatever you are producing. Then we say that dominance of this subsistence sector, it is an indicator of underdevelopment. Another indicator, high levels of unemployment. I think this ought to be first point, but all the same, high levels of unemployment. Whatever may have brought this unemployment, whatever may have brought about this unemployment, could be due to very many other factors. But just because there is unemployment, that is an indicator of underdevelopment. Another indicator are the utilization of natural resources. Underutilization of natural resources. We know very well that it is through these natural resources that the government is able to harness all these resources that the government is able now to manufacture. When you talk of these natural resources, for example, in our country, if I ask you to name the kind of natural resources that we have in our country, I believe the first one that you talk about is oil, for example, that was discovered just the other day in Turkana. But we have very many others when we have all these natural resources, our good climate that supports agriculture, when you talk about our seas, when you talk about our mountains, when you talk about our vegetation, when you talk about minerals, when you talk about all these are natural resources, when you talk about our climate in terms of we are in a region where it is possible to support agricultural activities. That is, when you talk about these natural resources, how is a country able to utilize its natural resources? When you talk of underutilization, you are talking about is it possible? Has the country been able to maximally utilize these resources? When you talk about agriculture, is it possible for our country to be able to produce produce agricultural products, maximally utilizing the land that we know it occurs naturally? Is it possible to use even other natural resources, our rivers, our lakes, to be able to even irrigate those areas where it is arable and maybe the only thing that lacks is rain? So we are talking of underutilization of these resources. If there is underutilization, meaning if we put resources to be able to utilize now these natural resources, it can be possible to develop. And so if they are underutilized, then we say we are underdeveloped. And lastly, when you have actually not the least, we still have I think quite a number more. When we have over-dependence on developed countries, over-dependence on developed countries. I don't know the reason why we would develop, that's how we would rely on these developed countries, but for whatever reason, we keep on asking our so-called development partners, come and assist us. These days we are talking of calling upon, for example, Chinese to come and assist us in almost every sector of our economy. Come and assist us to build SGR. Come and assist us to build these roads. Come and we have very many contractors. We have very many Chinese engineers who are involved in almost every part of our country. But the reason why we are saying that it could also be an indicator of underdevelopment. Is it possible for us to develop our own manpower to be able to build these roads? If it is yes, then why do we have to rely on others? Other times we even talk about borrowing from these so-called development partners. So it means that we are borrowing from them because they are already developed, and that means we are underdeveloped. That's an indicator of underdevelopment. Our infrastructure. When we have this infrastructure, when we have our roads, when we have our electricity, water system, talk about everything is like it's not working or it's not up to standard. That can be an indicator of underdevelopment. What we refer to as high life, others are low life expectancy as compared to high life. Low life expectancy due to limited sometimes healthcare or even poor nutrition. When you hear that a country is having very high level expectancy, It means that they have a lot of facilities to ensure that these people have good health care, they have good nutrition, to ensure that people are able to live for a very long time. That means there is high levels of life expectancy. Poor entrepreneurship, poor entrepreneurship, poor entrepreneurship. I believe this is not the first time to hear this term, entrepreneurship. When we have a country which has poor entrepreneurship, then we say that it can be an indicator of underdevelopment. Otherwise, if we put all the resources and ensure that people are provided with all the skills to ensure that they have these entrepreneurial skills to enable them run their businesses, to enable them not only benefit themselves as individuals, but even be able to benefit other people by way of running, by way of carrying out their business activities, their production activities, then we say that that country is developed. But when now we don't have this entrepreneurial skills, then we can say that a country is underdeveloped. Now, that brings us to the end of the second lesson. Thank you for your time. Thank you for participation. I would want you to go through the lesson once again, so that as we embark on the other lesson, you'll be able now to connect, so that you'll be able now to eventually go all the way to conclusion of this